I thought we'd go into one of the biblical characters who interacted in history in the movement of nations, and his name was Joseph of Arimathea. In our last broadcast together, I mentioned how a miracle took place in the writing of the Ark of the Covenant book, in which I asked the Lord for information about this man, and lo and behold, it was posted 2 weeks earlier and arrived the day I asked for it. And the promise in the Scriptures is that before they call, I will answer. So I thought we'd go into some detail about this man, Dr. Bill, because it's a very interesting story.
Please.
Okay. Now, today, I think we would call him, he was one of the wealthiest men. We'd call him a metal magnate. He's even been called the Carnegie of his age. And he controlled the tin and the lead industry in the Roman Empire. And that's how he became so wealthy. And a number of authorities from way back in that time claim that Joseph's world control of tin and lead was built on his huge holdings in the British tin mines. And he also reputedly owned one of the largest private merchant fleets afloat. And his ships went everywhere. Now, the tin that was mined in Cornwall, that's the southwest section of England, was smelted into ingots and exported on Joseph's ships, according to ancient historians. And it's interesting that the historians of that time called Britain the Tin Land. And it's interesting also that today, if you go to Cornwall, you'll see the remains of tin mines. I think the last one closed down about 20 years ago. They've been going right through history ever since. Now, Cornwall apparently had almost a world monopoly on tin. And archaeological evidence shows that the Tin Isles were exporting tin as early as 1500 BC. And those biblical ships of Tarshish that are mentioned in the story of King Solomon were operated mainly in connection with the Phoenician port of Tyre, where the main agents of transporting this metal lived and went to different parts of the world. And there's lots and lots of historians who are from ancient times who talk about these mines. And it was the British tin mines that mainly supplied the beautiful adornment of Solomon's temple. So the merchants shipped this all over the world. And in many places where Israelites set up their colonies, we find inscriptions and tombstones bearing witness to the fact. And but our particular concern is Cornwall, because this is where the story of Joseph of Arimathea begins to unfold. Now, I should mention, I think it was 1997, so it's about 20 years ago, just over. The last operating tin mine closed in 1997. In fact, the miners have always sung songs, the British miners, during their work underground, and the song actually has been, Joseph was a tin miner, Joseph was in the tin trade. So it certainly has come right down through history, the source of Joseph's wealth, and the Scriptures, the Bible says that he was a wealthy man. Well, indeed he was. He not only controlled the industry of metal, but he also had a fleet of ships that transported it. Now, there are false reports of history coming out of Rome. In fact, the Roman Empire claimed that they conquered Britain. Well, that is a lie. They never conquered Britain. Julius Caesar did try to conquer Britain, but his forces never got more than 70 miles in from the coast, and they were repelled. We're also told by Roman history, which is passed down into our school system worldwide, that the ancient British were savages, and they were civilized by the Romans. Once again, that's not so. The evidence shows that they had a very high standard of living, the archaeological evidence. Very high, one of the highest in the world at the time. And silver-plated coins have been found, which are very sophisticated. And they had good roads, and the roads weren't built by the Romans. They were used long before the Romans came. And some of the things that they did back there were absolutely astonishing. And the people themselves were very, very civilized. So the interesting thing now is where does Joseph of Arimathea fit in? Well, let's go back to the biblical story first of all. Why could Joseph claim the body of Jesus, to put the body into his own tomb? Well, both the Gospel of Mark and Luke refer to Joseph as a decurio. That's in the original tongue. And this term was used to designate an official in charge of metal mines. And he was a very influential member also of the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, the religious council. And it's also believed that he was a legislative member of a provincial Roman Senate. So when you consider that he owned a palatial home in Jerusalem as well as a fine country estate at the little town of Arimathea, you can estimate his financial and social standing. Okay. Arimathea, by the way, has a different name today. It's called Ramella today. If you go to, it's on the caravan route between Nazareth and Jerusalem. Okay. Now, the Talmud records that Joseph was the younger brother of the father of Mary, the Virgin. That would make him Mary's uncle. And that would make him a great-uncle to Jesus. And other secular reports say that Joseph was a married man. Also that his son, Josephus, left a mark of distinction in British history also. Well, the interesting thing about the claiming of a body was that Jesus was destined, according to the Jewish council, to be forgotten. They'd made 11 attempts on his life, according to the Gospels, but his time was not come, so it was only when the appointed time came, where Jesus was ready to offer himself, that he would be crucified. And Joseph, actually being a close relative, could legally go to the Roman emperor, Roman governor, and claim the body. It could be done by a close relative. However, by doing this, Joseph frustrated the desires of the Sanhedrin, of which he was a member, because they wanted Jesus' body to be thrown on the city rubbish dump, Gehenna rubbish dump, and burnt, along with all the other criminals, and his memory forgotten. But Joseph, by having built a very wealthy man's tomb and then handing that over for the burial of Jesus, would create a different perception of Jesus in the minds of lots of people. And this is not what the Sanhedrin wanted. This actually would have angered them. And Joseph actually stuck his neck out when he claimed the body of Jesus. And this, of course, was to lead to a sequence of events that would actually be very, very interesting. He went and claimed the body. He was granted the body by Pilate, the Roman governor, and Jesus was given an honourable burial. Now, when they heard what Joseph had done, giving his own tomb to Jesus, the Jewish leaders were furious. Joseph didn't know it yet, but he had just created for himself a dangerous enemy. And one of the men that I'm speaking of here was Saul. If only he knew Saul was going to turn this into a personal vendetta. And this is where we go into history outside the Bible. And this history is agreed among the different witnesses. Okay, so the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, quickly made their next move. Jesus had claimed that he would die and rise again after 3 days. And the Sanhedrin feared that Jesus' body might be snatched from the tomb by his followers to make the claim that he had risen. And so they had to act quickly for Roman help to keep that body in the tomb. And it was at their suggestion and under their supervision that the tomb was sealed with Jesus' body inside. And it was done by rolling a great stone over the entrance. And then 2 thick metal pegs were banged into the rock wall, one on each side of the great stone to stop it from moving. And after that, the Roman seal was attached. And to break that seal would mean death. And so secure was it made that no one could break it open, and Roman guards were ordered to watch it. And so, humanly speaking, they had won. Now, any supernatural element coming into this is out of the Sanhedrin's thoughts. But, as we know, unseen to everybody, a heavenly host surrounds the burial spot. Angels guard the tomb also, waiting to welcome Jesus. And then there is a great earthquake, and a heavenly being descends, clothed with huge light and radiance. The messenger leaves the heavenly courts, and he comes down to the tomb, and for fear of him, the guards shake, as we are told, and become as dead men. And the messenger calls Jesus out of the tomb. Come forth. And as he exits the tomb, alive again, the angel host bow down in adoration before him and welcome him with praise. And nothing could have stopped that. Now, my first visit to the site was a rather powerful experience, Dr. Bill. When I went into that tomb, which is there, still there, just north of Jerusalem, you're impressed with the size. And certainly only a rich man could have afforded a tomb like this. And inside the tomb, to the right, is a spot for the owner of the tomb to be laid, and close to that, another spot, perhaps for his wife. And to the left, a large room was cut out for mourners to stand. But this tomb was not used by the person for whom it had been cut. Because as you examine the tomb today, you go to Jerusalem and examine it, one section carved out of the rock to fit one man had clearly been enlarged for somebody else, someone who was taller than the owner of the tomb for whom it had been originally measured. And this hastily cut out section, about 6 inches more, to make room for somebody else's feet, indicates that not the owner but some other person actually was laid in the rich man's tomb exactly as the scripture tells us. And for me, that was a deeply emotional experience to stand alone inside that tomb, staring at the empty space.
Yeah, Jesus was
and
tall,
I realized that the one who'd been there died for me personally.
And he was tall, wasn't he, Jesus?
Yes, that's right.
He was literally Lamed, taller than the rest.
Yes, exactly, Dr. Bill.
Continue.
Yes, so after Joseph of Arimathea had buried Jesus in his own tomb, he was a marked man. The religious leaders were infuriated. And historical record says that Joseph was imprisoned by those leaders, but he was miraculously delivered. And that, plus other events, simply enraged them further. Well, the disciples who had witnessed the risen Christ and those who could testify that he was alive again were causing a stir, and that would be an understatement. And since the resurrection, the message of Jesus became more widely known, more widely accepted, and they couldn't stop it. Now, the Gestapo of the Sanhedrin was placed under the control of a vengeful man named Saul, and he lost no time. Quickly and viciously, he hunted down the followers of the Way, and that's what Christianity was called at the time, the Way, and openly and in secret, he struck without any mercy. And according to non-biblical records of that time, the prisons were crammed with victims. And the first notable victim, of course, we're told of is Stephen, who led a brilliant defense of Jesus before the Sanhedrin. And he was also defying the Sadducees, who did not believe in a resurrection. And now Stephen was dragged from his pulpit, publicly stoned to death for speaking about Jesus, and Saul's henchmen enjoyed their victory, and Saul himself was ecstatic, holding the coats of the killers who did this terrible act. And Stephen died by the gate in Jerusalem that still bears his name. All right. As the havoc continued, Joseph fearlessly protected men and women because he had lots of wealth. At every opportunity, he did what he could to help. And Saul absolutely hated Joseph of Arimathea. He was aware of Joseph's influence, but he was bursting to get Joseph. And he became more furious as the days went by. And he waited his opportunity. Anyway, they could not stem the tide of the news of the resurrection of Jesus. The message took hold and reached the whole world. And the persecution began to backfire. It's interesting, when persecutors start attacking something, it very often backfires against them, and people start inquiring all the more, well, why is there such a supernatural hatred against this? What's wrong with it? And so people start investigating, and when they investigate, they find evidence, and so persecution can make the gospel go. Now, it's very, very interesting that Britain was not a Christian country at this time, but they did have the knowledge of the prophecies of the coming Messiah. And as the time went, Britain was going to hear about it, and this is what happened. Back to our story of Joseph, the man who gave his own tomb for Jesus. Now, he was protecting men and women from the persecution of Saul's Gestapo. At every opportunity, Joseph stood as a tower of strength, and Saul was becoming more angry about it. And so what happened to Joseph? Well, 4 years after the resurrection of Jesus, the scene moved down toward the coast to Joppa. And during the night, something had happened. Saul's Gestapo had burst into the homes in Bethany, which is just east of Jerusalem. They burst into the homes of Lazarus and Mary and Martha and their house girl and arrested them and were taking them down toward the seacoast. They burst into Joseph's house and took him as well. and they burst into, and he was actually looking after Mary, the mother of Jesus at that time. He, being a close relative, was helping out because of his wealth. He could help protect them, even though the guardian of Mary was John. Joseph took over with his money and prestige and power and gave her better protection. And eventually about a dozen people were herded out during the middle of the night and shipped down to the sea coast, to Joppa. And then they were put onto a boat, and another boat came in close to tow them out to sea. And 4 strong men gave their craft a push. And here they were now, 12 or 13 people, I think it was 13, cast adrift in the sea. Their oars had been taken away from them. Their sails had been taken off the boat. And we do not know to die. And this way, no one could get the blame for it. Oh, they just went out and they died. It wasn't us. And so Saul could not get the blame, neither could anyone else get the blame. It was hoped that their treachery would eventually consign Joseph and his companions to a watery grave. And so after they'd been hurled into the small boat, Saul smugly believed that was the end of the story. I don't want to see you again, he said. And he would never have to look upon Joseph again. Well, we have a lot of information from ancient times about this. In fact, we are given the names of those who went in. And it was 13 people. But a good number of sources tell us that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was also on that boat. Now, as they drifted, Joseph actually knew how to survive at sea, and they eventually landed up at the south coast of France, near where Marseille is today. And Joseph and Mary went across. France was called Gaul at that time, and a legation of people who heard about what was happening came across the channel and helped Joseph and Mary to get across to Britain. Now, it's very, very interesting that these people had a knowledge of the coming Messiah, and they were looking for him to come. And when they got the news that he had died and risen, they were happy to shelter Joseph and Mary. And so outside the dominion of the Roman Empire, where the Jews could not reach them, the Jewish persecutors or any Roman persecutors could not reach them, the British Isles stood as a refuge. And once again, I should say, the British Isles had not been conquered successfully. So in Cornwall in particular, where the tin mines were, that was under the rule of a puppet king who was very friendly to Joseph. They developed a good business relationship in the past, and now it was a friendly family relationship. And they recognized the prophecy that they had all these hundreds of years as having been fulfilled. As a matter of fact, I have in my mind a quotation from one of their books, and it is very similar to one in the Bible. It is, "Open ye gates, and the King of glory shall come in." Who is this King of glory? This King of glory is Yeshua. Now, if that's not telling us who he is, and we have from the Old Testament, of course, writings that do give us the name of Jesus, Yeshua, his Hebrew name. And these people in Britain were well aware of that name. And when Joseph and Mary came across to Britain, they gave them a place to stay in Cornwall. And we have lots of ancient documents testifying to this fact. So when they arrived in Britain, they had a place of safety to stay. Now, that's just one part of the story. And they were free. And the first act that was given was to secure to Joseph, as a perpetual gift, free of tax, 12 hides of land, a total of just under 2,000 acres. And this historic spot, for the rest of Britain's history, was to take the memory of Joseph of Arimathea, and a little church was built there. And it survived until the 1600s. It continued right down until the 1600s. A little wattle-built church made of wattle. And apparently the building was something like about 60 feet long, 26 feet wide, following the pattern of the Hebrew tabernacle. And it was finished within 2 or 3 years. Okay. And soon, with the help of his hosts, Joseph and his companions went throughout Britain to share the news of Jesus Christ. And so Britain became the first of all the kingdoms to receive the gospel. And here these faithful, dedicated people were able to teach as a whole nation, the first complete nation to accept the good news. Free from the persecution of the Jewish Sanhedrin and free from the tyranny of pagan Rome. And they were protected by the might of the British, who devoted their lives to the teachings of the Lord in the quiet sunlight of that green land away off Europe, off the coast. Now, we'll leave Joseph for a moment there. Now, in trying to prevent the spread of Christianity by casting Joseph adrift in a boat, Saul's Gestapo had failed miserably. The despised ones had survived and found freedom to spread the good news without fear of being molested. And Saul's organization began to collapse soon after this. And here is what triggered it. Filled with rage and hate, Saul was personally on his way to Damascus, and we have that account in the book of Acts, don't we? And he was going to arrest Christians there, and suddenly there was a burst of light, and he saw the being who appeared. And then he was instantly struck blind, and he heard the person's voice. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And a conversation followed, and the speaker identified himself as Jesus. And then Saul was instructed where to go and what to do. And still blind, this Gestapo chief was led to Damascus, and his sight was restored in the house of a Christian. And Saul's life was dramatically and unexpectedly changed forever. He was converted to the way. Now, this linked chain of events was so sensational, no one believed it at first. Even the Christians were skeptical. And the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem was stunned by fury. And they ordered an all-out manhunt against Saul. Instructions were to kill him on sight. And the hunter now became the hunted. And Saul's fearless testimony, now as Paul the Apostle, began to set the world on fire. And that was a turning point of early Christianity. And so, as we know, Paul began to travel constantly. In every city he went, the result was either a revival or a riot. And his enemies pursued him from city to city. Now, Paul had been born a free man, and we'll go on to that after the break.
Amazing story. This is the pre-story now mixed to the Bible. Makes it all a lot of sense. Amazing how God deals with people, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is.
Best screenplay for probably the best next drop blockbuster movie, The Conversion of Saul, or as you say, the man who received 2 graves. Please expand on that.
Yep. So Paul, because he was a free man by Roman law, when he was ultimately arrested for his new Christian faith, Paul appealed to the Roman emperor, and this decision was fateful. It would lead him to Rome itself. And this is where we come to an odd sequence of events, a twist in Paul's destiny that would eventually take him to Britain. Now, Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, had issued an edict for another invasion of Britain because Julius Caesar's invasion had failed. Claudius wanted a war of religious extermination because he wanted to crush Christianity at its source and strength where Britain was. Rome had conquered all the world except Britain. The emperor selected a commander-in-chief for the invasion of Britain, and then he had a personal aide-de-camp named Rufus Pudens. Now, remember that last name. We'll come to it again in a few minutes. And he landed in Britain in the year 43, and then he realized that he was confronted with a military intelligence in England that matched his own, as well as an army of fearless defenders. In fact, for 9 years, this greatest of Roman generals failed to take Britain. And the Romans had never met their match before. They fought everywhere, in the sands, in the fields, in the streets, in the lanes. And the British commander, King Caractacus, and his family had accepted the new Christian faith, and some of them had been baptized by Joseph of Arimathea. And they were fighting to defend their new faith, that it not be squashed. And brutally destroying everything in their path, the Romans were never able to pierce through to the Isle of Avalon, where Joseph and his Bethany companions had planted the saving message of Christ. For the first time, the Romans met woman warriors fighting side by side with their men. And they were shouting the truth against the world. And the Roman campaign failed. So the emperor called a truce. And the Romans were very good at by peace, destroying people, as prophecy says. So when they destroyed peace, when they claimed peace, they infiltrated the British lines, found a relative of the king, who was of the Christian king, who was jealous of him, and offered to pay this woman. I think she was a cousin, offered to pay her a large sum of money if she would betray the king and hand him over to the Romans. And so the king and his family, in their sleep, were tied up and then hurled across to the Romans. And the British royal family, having been betrayed, were now prisoners of Rome. They were shipped to Rome. And the news of their capture spread like wildfire. And heavily chained, the king proudly walked with his family behind him through the crowded streets of Rome to his trial. And he had a daughter called Gladys. She refused to be separated from her father. Now, it was against Roman law for a woman to enter the Senate. And yet, because the emperor saw what a courageous girl this was, he broke the law, and he invited her to speak to the Senate too, and she proclaimed Jesus to the Roman Senate. And then the emperor, who wanted to wipe out Christianity, fell in love with the young girl. He changed her name from Gladys to Claudia, and adopted her as his daughter. Now, the interesting thing was that the only restriction that they would be given now was that they would have a house given to them, and they would be on parole for 7 years, and they were never to bear arms against Rome. And so they were honored. Remember that Claudius had hated Christianity, and Christians at Rome were unorganized, moving in fear. They met secretly in house groups or under the streets in the catacombs. But for this royal family, Christians though they were, the Emperor Claudius had great respect for them and pardoned them. Now, the fact is that he renamed her Claudia. And if you look at Paul, writing to the Romans, and he talks about, and by the way, she married Rufus Pudicius, who was a Roman aide-de-camp of the Roman army. And this is where Paul re-enters the picture 5 years on. When Paul arrived in Rome in 58, he met up with his half-brother, who was Rufus Pudicius. He was the half-brother in the Roman army. And Paul refers to him in the book of Romans, chapter 16. He says, "Salute Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother and mine," so they were brothers. Wow. Now, in another letter, Paul also mentions Claudia. That's in the second book of Timothy. So Rufus and Claudia now became close friends with Paul, entertaining him. Now, Paul had met people here who had been baptized by Joseph of Arimathea. Paul had put Joseph of Arimathea in a boat and said, "I never want to see you again." But now Paul wanted to go to Britain to make right with Joseph. And so Paul established Rome's first open church in the home of the British king and Claudia and her husband, Rufus. And Paul ordained Linus, Claudia's brother, who's also mentioned in the Bible, as the first leader of the Christian church in Rome. Now, an amazing twist of events. Before his capture by the Romans, Linus had been baptized in Britain by Joseph of Arimathea. Now Joseph had also baptized Paul's sister-in-law, Claudia. And now Linus, an exile from Rome, was personally appointed as the first leader of the Christian church in Rome. And who did that? Paul. So a man baptized by Joseph was now ordained by Paul. Joseph was hunted and Paul the hunter. And now the two former enemies, their two lives merged. And Paul went to Rome. Went from Rome, rather, to Britain. And we still have relics in Britain of that visit. And he must have just hugged the man that he tried to execute and made friends with him, and now they were brothers in Christ. Now, we're told in old documents that he landed at Portsmouth, and even today in Portsmouth there still stands Paul's Grove to commemorate the area. That was 20 years after the arrival in Britain of Joseph.
Wow. I never knew this history. Wow.
Yes. Now, something else, if I just have time to finish this.
Six more minutes.
If I can hurry it.
Yeah, 6 more minutes. Lots of time.
Yes. When Saul put Joseph of Arimathea adrift, Joseph of Arimathea had his own personal diary, written as Jesus' uncle, a great uncle. He had his own personal diary of the events of the Gospels. He had written his own book. It's not an inspired book as the New Testament is, but it was his own family tree book. And that book actually was carefully guarded. Now, in the same place where Joseph of Arimathea was buried, at Glastonbury in Cornwall, south-west Britain, I've been there, and we've examined, we've investigated. These people, Joseph took with him, and his descendants received from him this diary of events in the life of Jesus that were witnessed by Joseph of Arimathea himself, and the teachings of Jesus. And these are very, very different, these teachings, from what most of the churches in apostasy are doing today. They speak of the Ten Commandments as being eternal. They speak of everything exactly as it should be. And if you compare the Gospels with the book of Joseph of Arimathea, they're identical in their teachings. And they also tell stories, beautiful little personal interest stories that Joseph observed in the life of Jesus as he watched him. And that book was outlawed when the Vatican sent its soldiers across to Britain to take over Britain and turn all the British, whom they called pagans, to Rome. They outlawed every book in Britain that was not written in Latin. which meant that all Hebrew scriptures, all the Greek, all British were outlawed. You only were allowed to have Latin books. And so the people, the descendants of Joseph, actually hid this book. It went underground, you might say. And very, very interesting thing happened. And I think that it's such an interesting story, we'll do it on the next broadcast.
What people need to understand is God will intervene, just like he's going to intervene at the time of the end now. We are years and months away, not decades away from the end of secular history, aren't we?
That is right, yes. And
God will intervene just like he did with Saul.
Speeding up.
He'll intervene with Saul and with Paul and with the church, which, to be honest with you, right now, the church is apostate. They're, as I mentioned yesterday with Kelby Smith, the main enemy of the gospel at the time of the end is not the devil, because he says plainly what he's going to do. It's the church and their pastors that preach apostasy and don't accept apostolic and prophetic word.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
It's hard for Christians to believe that, but their very pastors are the ones holding back the true gospel at the time of the end, aren't they?
Yeah, that is true. But people trust in man rather than what the Word of God. And this is going to be their downfall.
Well, let me run through a bunch of major apostasies. Number one, once saved, always saved. Number two, there is a hell. When God, if you're not one of God's children, you're destroyed, you're annihilated. Number three, that there's a millennium after Jesus comes back. We have the double millennium of grace right now, and when Jesus returns, the devil is cast into the abyss and destroyed. The fourth one, that there's three gods, when really Yeshua is not just a prophet, he's the Father in the flesh. That's what his name means, Yahashua HaMashiach. So these apostasies are hampering the church. Also that you can have a works gospel, which is preached through the Catholic Church. And many of the Christian churches now do the same thing. A works gospel doesn't work. You can't forgive yourself by works. You can only be forgiven by walking with God, right?
That's right.
So all these apostasies are preached by the ministers of the church, and they hamper their sheep and put them in grave danger, don't they?
That's right.
And we see that even with the false high-level Masons. For example, Donald Trump. He's not a Christian. A lot of Christians worship him, think he's a Christian. He's not.